So lesson 4, we're going to talk about independent and dependent quantities. Your essential question is, what is the difference from independent and dependent quantities? I don't know either. We're going to find out. So what's the difference between independent and dependent quantities? That's your question. So the meat and potatoes of all of this is this nifty little chart. Meat and potatoes, the good stuff. Okay? If you change the independent quantity, it causes change in the dependent quantity. That is the most straightforward definition that I could think of to explain this whole concept. So if we have two different variables or two different quantities going on here, changing the independent quantity causes change to happen in the dependent quantity. Okay? And then this definition, like literally if you Googled it or looked in your textbook for the academic definition of these things, it gives you this sentence below, which is why I was saying they're kind of dependent on a dependent definition. The dependent quantity, depends on the independent quantity. It's not a great definition. But if you were to look it up in your book, it really will say the dependent quantity depends on the independent quantity. Okay? Meaning, if you have two things and you change the independent quantity, it's automatically going to affect what happens to the dependent quantity. Okay? Another way that I like to think about this is the independent quantity is the one that only you have control over changing. And the dependent will follow. Okay? You'll see when I give you an example. Okay, so you guys will get situations explained to you in words, and you're going to have to figure out what the independent and dependent quantity are. But I'm also eventually going to ask you to then graph that situation. And you have to figure out where the label on the graph goes. So x is always the independent variable. Okay? Which should make sense, because in an equation like, I don't know, y equals 2x, let's say, do you pick values to plug in for y, or do you pick values to plug in for x? For x, right? And then y follows. So that is your y. X is always your independent variable, because that is where you are plugging stuff into, and what gets spit out is y. So y is dependent on x. Does that make sense? So you're going to be asked to do several things with this. And when we're actually graphing it, that's what we're going to do tomorrow, or on block day, on Thursday. But I want you to have it here because it's actually related to this concept. So when you get a situation written in words, you are going to have to tell me in words what the independent and dependent variables are. And then I'm also going to ask you to graph the situation, but you always have to label your graph. So you have to know where each one goes. So whatever you identify as the independent, that goes on your x-axis. Whatever you identify as the dependent, that goes on your y-axis. So for example, the situation is the number of hours you work and the amount of money you earn. And in your homework, you're going to be asked to, I think it's underline the independent. Oh no, I don't ask you to do either one of those. I just say to write it down. Okay, so we're going to underline the independent. We're going to put a box around the dependent, and then we'll fill in underneath. So let's think about this. You have a job. The number of hours you work, or you work a certain number of hours, and then you earn a certain amount. So you get paid an hourly wage. What is it that is affecting the other? Or, in other words, what do you have control over? Do you have control over the number of hours you worked? Or do you have control over how much money you earn? Tell your neighbor. Let's think about the situation. You as a worker can't say, well, I want to earn $50 this week, so I want to earn $50 and that's all I'm going to work. you can't earn the money unless you do the work, right? So the amount of time that you work is determining how much money you make. Does that make sense? Okay, so your independent quantity is going to be the number of hours worked. And here is how I want you to be very specific with writing this. The quantity is, I guess we can just write the number of hours worked. So we can say number of hours worked. And our dependent is the amount of money that you earn. Okay, so let's say amount earned. And then here's where the very last part of these notes are going to come in. Look at your independent quantity. It says the number of hours worked. So that means that we are counting your time in what unit? In hours, right? So another way that you could write this is time, and actually write it right next to it, but I'm going to erase it on mine. Time in what? Hours. And this is even more specific. This is how you would label your graph. The x-axis is time in hours, right? So then the dependent says the amount earned. What is the amount earned being measured in?
Money.
Okay, but money, there's lots of different types of money. How are you getting paid?
Dollars.
Dollars. So you would write in parentheses, dollars. And this is why I want you to make sure that you are being very precise. When I ask for the independent quantity, the quantity here is time. The measure is in hours. Because time can be measured in multiple ways, right? You're not going to get paid per minute or per second. You're getting paid per hour. The money is the quantity, and how it's being measured is in dollars, okay? So a lot of students say the independent quantity is hours. Hours is the units, or how it's being measured. The actual quantity is time. So you have to put both, okay? And that's where this very next part comes into play. So with quantity versus units, you are going to want to include both of those things in your independent and dependent quantities. But the quantity is what you're actually writing, and the units you will always put in parentheses. Okay? So you'll put parentheses behind it because that makes it more specific. So the quantity is what is being measured. In the example we did, it was time. The units is how it is being measured. How was time being measured? In hours. Okay? In the dependent, the what was being measured was the amount you earned. How was it being measured? In dollars. Okay? So I put two quantities and a unit up here, and we need to figure out units, stuff that will look at that. So on the left, if the quantity is time, what are different ways that we measure time? Hours, minutes, seconds, days, etc., right? That's enough, I think. Okay, so depending on the problem, it might make sense to measure something in minutes or in seconds or in days. Okay, so those are just some examples of units of time. Okay, so if the quantity was time, in parentheses, you would want to put one of these things, telling you how it's being measured. What if we're looking at pounds? So what if the unit is pounds? What is actually being measured? What's the quantity? Weight. So if it says Jill starts an exercise routine and she loses 5 pounds per week. Oh, that's a lot. 1 pound per week. What is actually the quantity? Weight, and it's being measured in pounds. Okay, so when it asks you the dependent quantity, you would say weight in parentheses pounds. Okay? If I say I'm losing a pound per week, the independent would be the time, and that's measured in weeks, right? Okay? What about distance? What if we're talking about somebody that's walking to the store, and the distance is your quantity? What are ways that we measure distance? Inches, feet, yards, miles. What about metric? Kilometers, meters, etc., etc. Okay? So you need to make sure that when you're stating your independent and dependent quantities, that you are being very specific. You are telling me what the quantity is, and then in parentheses, how it's being measured. Okay? So we have a whole left side to do questions and a summary. We will take care of that on block day. We'll do it together. We'll practice. Right now you have all the information that you need to do your homework.